There is a name in your family that did not survive the crossing intact. It left a German village where everyone knew exactly what it meant and arrived in a country that could not spell it or pronounce it. So it changed, one letter at a time, in the handwriting of clerks who had no reason to check themselves, until nobody remembered there had ever been anything to correct. You still carry that name today, but beneath it is a German word that once told an entire village who your family was. In medieval Germany, a surname could reveal a man's job, status, or place in the community before he spoke. But when these names were absorbed into English, that record often disappeared. Sometimes the sound survived while the meaning was lost. Sometimes the meaning survived while the sound was completely transformed. Some German names changed so completely that today, almost nobody realizes where they came from. Today we are counting down 13 German surnames that America took and what each one meant before it was taken. Stay until the end, because number 1 is the single most common surname in Germany, and in America it does not exist. It was swallowed whole by an English name that was already standing here. One thing before we begin, because this channel does not trade in myths, your family's name was not changed at Ellis Island. That is one of the biggest myths in American history. Ellis Island officials did not make up or rewrite immigrants' names. They simply checked passenger lists that had already been created by the shipping companies before the ship even left Germany. If there was a mistake on those lists, the officials usually corrected it. They did not create it, so no clerk stole your name. The theft came later, and it came slowly, from neighbors who could not pronounce it, and employers who would not hire it, and a teacher who read it aloud wrong in front of a room full of children who laughed. Nobody signed a paper. That is what makes it a theft. Number 13. We begin with a name that was not killed by a government or an employer. It was killed by children. Fuchs. In America, it became Fox, and Foos and Fuchs. And occasionally Fuchs left untouched by families who refused to bend. It means fox, and it was handed to a man for one of two reasons. Either he had red hair, or he was thought too clever by half to be trusted. Said the German way, it comes out Fuchs, and English happens to have a word that sits very close to that and means something else entirely. Every German child in an American classroom learned this within a week. Nobody signed a paper. That is what makes it a theft. But if your name is Fox, your family did not surrender to a law. They surrendered to a playground, and they did it to protect a child. The next name cost nothing at all to give up, which is precisely why so many gave it. Number 12. Here is the quietest theft on this entire list. Braun. And said the German way, it comes out brown, exactly as you say it now. In America, it became brown and brawn, and brawn and brawn left as it was. It means brown given to a man for the color of his hair by neighbors who described him once, in passing, and watched it harden into something his grandsons carried. Nothing about it was ever pronounced differently. 4 letters were reordered on a form, and a German family became invisible in a single afternoon. Now the discipline matters here, because Brown is the 4th most common surname in America, and the overwhelming majority of American Browns are English or Scottish, which means your Brown is probably not German at all, but some of them are. And precisely because the change cost nothing, those families left behind no trace of the moment they made it. But if your name is Brown, you may be carrying the only name here that was given up without a single word of protest. The next name could not be given up quietly, because Americans could not even guess at it. Number 11. This name contains a sound that does not exist in the English language. Coke. In America, it became cook and cock and cock, and Coke pronounced by its owners as Coke. It means cook. He fed a household. He answered to a steward. He was judged daily by men who never thanked him. That final sound in Coke is the one in the Scottish word lock, and no American mouth produces it without practice. So Americans guessed instead Koch, Coach, Coke, until families translated themselves into English to make it stop. The Koch family of Kansas landed on Coke and has been correcting people ever since. Nobody ordered this. That is what makes it a theft. But if your name is Cook, your family may have surrendered its language for no greater reason than to stop hearing its own name mangled at every introduction. Those 3 names were lost to a machine. The next 5 were handed over. Number 10. This name was mispronounced the very first time an American read it silently off a page. Weber. In America, it became Weaver, and Weber and Weber, and Weber left as written. It means weaver, and it belonged to a man who worked a loom in his own front room, answered to a cloth merchant who never touched thread, and raised children who worked beside him before they could reach the frame. The German W is an English V, which means the moment this name was read instead of heard, its pronunciation was already gone. A family had two options: correct every American they would ever meet, or stop. That's why if your name is Weaver, your ancestors did not lose their name to hostility. They lost it to exhaustion. The next name did not lose its sound. It lost every sound it had. Number 9, this is the cleanest destruction on the list. Zimmerman. In America, it became carpenter, and Zimmerman with one N, and Zimmer, and Timmerman. From Zimmer, which once meant timber rather than room. He raised roof beams. He framed houses that outlived him by 2 centuries. He owned tools worth more than everything else he had. Zimmerman and carpenter share not one sound between them, nothing an ear could catch. And yet it is a flawless translation, which is exactly the point. And there is this. Arthur Zimmermann was the German foreign minister whose 1917 telegram helped drag America into war against Germany. In the very year American Zimmermans were quietly becoming carpenters. But if your name is Carpenter, your family kept its trade down to the last detail and surrendered every sound that trade had ever been spoken in. The next name traded no craft at all. It traded something people still imagine was a crown. Number 8. This name sounds like a throne, and it almost never was one. König. König. In America it became king, and König, and Kunkel, and Kung. It is simply the German word for king, which is why the discipline matters here more than anywhere else on this list. Because almost no family carrying König descends from royalty of any kind. The Oxford Dictionary of American Family Names gives it instead as a nickname for a king's servant or retainer, a farmer working a royal estate, or as a status name for the head of a craftsman's guild, a company of minstrels, or a society of sharpshooters, whose champion was crowned Schützenkönig, king of the marksmen, for exactly 1 year. There is a second road in. King is also the anglicized form of Kung, which in many German dialects is pronounced almost exactly like the English word, and that form runs deep through American Mennonite and Amish families. But every one of those paths runs through the same door, because to be called the king at all, you had to stand close enough to one to be measured against him. Nobody signed a paper. That is what makes it a theft. But if your name is King, your family never wore the crown. It stood near enough to be named for it. The next name held no crown either. It held something considerably more useful. Number 7. This is the only name here that carried authority rather than a trade. Schultz, Schultz. In America, it became Schultz, and Schultz, and Schulze, and Schultz. From the Middle High German Schultheiß, a compound of Skold, meaning debt, and a derivative of Heißen, meaning to command, the one who commands debts. He collected the Lord's dues. He kept order in the village. He answered personally for both. The Oxford Dictionary of American Family Names lists Schultz and Schultz flatly as Americanized forms of it, and what they are Americanizing is the village headman, part mayor and part constable, standing between an entire community and the man who owned the ground it lived on. Nobody signed a paper. That is what makes it a theft. But if your name is Schultz, your ancestor was the man the village came to when something went wrong, and the man they quietly resented on every day that nothing did. The next family did not wait for pressure of any kind. It changed before anyone thought to ask. Number 6. This name was already gone before the United States existed. Hoop. In America, it became Hoover, and Hoover, and Huber, and Hoofer. A Huber was a farmer who owned his own land. In medieval Germany, that piece of land was called a Hube. Unlike a laborer, he worked fields he could pass down to his sons, paid his dues instead of working another man's land, and held a place in society that most ordinary peasants never could. Hubers reached Pennsylvania decades before the Revolution, many of them Mennonite, and had generally become Hoovers by the 1760s. They did not wait for a war, and it worked so completely that in 1929, a descendant became president with nothing left in the name for an opponent to use. But if your name is Hoover, your family bought its way into America 2 full centuries ago and paid in the only currency it had on hand. So far, every family made a choice. Watch what happens when the choice is taken away. Number 5. This name never changed in the mouth at all, only on paper. Jung. And it is already pronounced Jung. In America, it became Young, and Jung, and Junge, and Jung as written. It means the younger. And it began as a way of separating a son from a father who carried the same given name, which meant a man was named for what he had not yet become, then carried it into old age and handed it to a son younger still. The German J is an English Y, and that single fact did more damage to German names in America than any law ever passed. The same trap turned Yoder into Yoder among the Amish, and turned Jüngling into Jüngling, when David Gottlob Jüngling anglicized on arrival and founded the brewery in 1829 that still carries the respelling. No law demanded it. That is what makes it a theft. But if your name is Young, nothing was ever taken from your grandfather's voice. It was taken from his handwriting. The next name did not change once, it split in two, and the halves never found each other again. Number 4, Schneider. In America, it became Snyder and Taylor, and Schneider unchanged. From Schneiden to cut, it belonged to a tailor, a man who spent his life measuring other men, cutting cloth he could not afford, and dressing a village that outranked him. And then it split. Some families went by sound and became Snyder or Snyder, keeping the noise of the name and losing its meaning entirely, while others went by meaning and became Taylor, keeping the trade and losing every sound. One German name, one generation, 2 American surnames that will never recognize each other. But if your name is Snyder, there are Taylors in this country standing closer to your blood than almost anyone you have ever met. The next name did not split at all. It could not even be printed. Number 3, Jaeger. In America, it became Jaeger, and Jaeger, and Jaeger, and Jaeger. It means hunter or gamekeeper, and it belonged to a man who tracked game across a lord's forest, carrying a weapon most men of his rank were forbidden to own, answering to nobody below the man who owned the trees. Said correctly, it comes out Yaegu, and the name carried 2 problems at once. The J that every American reader got wrong, and the umlaut that no American form, ledger, or typewriter in the country could physically print. Jaeger solved both in a single move, and the Oxford Dictionary of American Family Names lists it flatly as the Americanized form. The most famous Jaeger in history broke the sound barrier in 1947, carrying a name that means hunter in a language he did not speak a word of. But if your name is Jaeger, your family was armed and trusted in a century when almost nobody was permitted to be either. Every name so far was given up. What happened next was not. Traded for a job, for a schoolyard, for a quiet life. In 1917, that stopped being a trade. America declared war on Germany in April of that year, and President Wilson declared German citizens living here alien enemies, barred from port towns and the capital, required to register and submit to fingerprinting. States banned German language schooling outright, 34 of them by the early 1920s, and South Dakota went further, banning German on the telephone and in any gathering of 3 or more people. And it turned violent. A Minnesota man was tarred and feathered for praying in German over a dying woman. And in April 1918, in Collinsville, Illinois, a German-born man named Robert Prager was dragged out of a jail cell by a mob and lynched, and the men tried for it were acquitted. Here is the story that finishes the point. America's greatest flying ace of that war was born Edward Rickenbacker in Columbus, Ohio, to Swiss immigrants. Not German, Swiss. It made no difference, because the name read German on a page. So he swapped the H for a K, added Vernon as a middle name because it sounded classier, and wrote afterward that most Rickenbackers were from then on practically forced to spell it his way. That is the year the choice stopped being a choice. The last 2 names were not changed. They were absorbed. Number 2. This is the largest disappearance in the history of American naming. Schmidt. In America, it became Smith and Schmidt and Schmid and Smith. It means the man who worked iron at a forge, shod the horses and mended the tools of everyone around him, and was the one man a village could not do without. Say it plainly, most American Smiths are not German, because Smith is the most common surname in America, and the great majority of it is English and always has been. But Schmidt is the second most common surname in Germany. and the translation between them is exact, which is precisely why the absorption was total. A Schmidt could become a Smith and say, honestly and without shame, that he had not changed his name at all. Only the language it was spoken in. Nobody had to change the name, and that is what makes it a theft. But if your name is Smith, no living person can tell from the name alone which of those two lines you came down from. Only the paperwork remembers. And the last name on this list did not even leave paperwork. Number 1. The most common surname in Germany. In America, functionally extinct. Müller. In America, it became Miller and Muller and Muller and Muller. It means the miller. He ran the one machine an entire village could not live without. He took his share of every harvest that passed through his hands. He was needed by everyone and trusted by almost nobody, because a miller who weighed dishonestly could starve a family slowly and never be caught. Said correctly, it is Mulu, with the lips rounded, and then it arrived in a country whose typewriters and ledgers and census forms could not print that umlaut at all. So families wrote Muller as a workaround, and Muller drifted into Miller, and Miller is not the same name. Miller is an English surname with its own English families and villages, standing here long before any German ship arrived. Two separate bloodlines poured into one word, and the German half vanished inside it. But if your name is Miller, the most common name in Germany may be sitting in your mouth every single day of your life, and there is no longer any way left to hear it. Not one of these families was robbed at a desk by a man in a uniform. Every one of them was worn down instead, a thread cut one strand at a time across 60 years, until nobody left alive remembered there had been a thread there at all. Nobody could point to the moment it disappeared. That is what makes it a theft. Now make sure to drop your surname in the comments, and I will tell you what it was before. And if you want the next set decoded, the Irish names, the Italian names, the names nobody ever told you were yours, subscribe now. Your history is not finished. You have only stopped reading it.